This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Dr. Nadia Maroouf, clinical scientist and analog astronaut, on how microgravity accelerates aging and what she's doing to protect astronauts. But first, our hosts discuss the latest news, including fallout between Elon Musk and President Trump and what it means. They then discuss yet another example of how space is hard, as ispace discovered again this week.
Mike, it's good to see you. We have got a lot to talk about today. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah. So let's talk this week about the human condition, right? Let's talk about relationships and crying and how that old cliche, space is hard, is true. So let's start. Last week, I was emceeing an event here in DC for the ispace resilience lunar lander. We had a watch party we did with the Commercial Space Federation and ispace US. And I'll tell you, I had my phone off from about 1 o'clock until maybe 4:30. And I went as soon as this event was over, and we're going to get back and talk about that in a little bit. But as soon as it was over, I went to mingle with some other folks, and they said, you won't believe what's happening. This is not even the biggest space story of the afternoon." I was like, what is going on? And obviously there was this destruction of, or at least temporary destruction of, the Trump-Musk relationship, which included
Done over social
the
media.
president.
Interesting, too.
Yeah, right. And on their own social media, as I think folks have pointed out. And so the president obviously said the easiest way to save money in our budget is to terminate Elon's government subsidies and contracts. Obviously, a lot of people read that as potentially getting rid of a lot of SpaceX contracts. And, Musk responded on his own and, talked about, hey, well, all right, well, we'll just leave the ISS. And it got very ugly very fast. And I think it led to a lot of soul searching within the space community, right? That I think there were a lot of questions about how would it even be possible, contract issues aside, would it even be possible to separate the government from SpaceX? What would that look like? And that leaves all sorts of questions, right? How do you get to and from the International Space Station? How do you launch national security satellites? What's that going to mean for the National Reconnaissance Office and the intelligence community and Starshield? And just a whole bunch of questions. There was a story over the weekend from the Washington Post that talked about government officials contacting other launch providers, seeing how quickly they could be ready if they were needed. So the conversation really escalated pretty quickly. But I think there's obviously a lot of caution here, right? Because all of us talked about, maybe not as openly, but I think there were certainly whispers within the space community, like, hey, eventually this relationship may not go as well as everyone expects. What's going to happen then? I know the first time that came up to me, someone brought that up to me was last summer. So, I don't think folks expected them to be as tight as maybe they appeared for a very, very long time. But, even recently, we've seen some of the investment community, Byron Callen of Capital Alpha Partners. He's a very respected researcher in the defense community. He said, yeah, other contractors could step in and fill that gap between SpaceX and Starlink. And he was like, but where they're not going to be able to meet on a whole bunch of levels, maybe when it comes to launch cadence or latency or cost. There's a whole lot of questions there. And he said he was skeptical that these exchanges would lead to anything that would harm launch capability. So a really whirlwind, I don't know, 4 or 5 days now. And I think even, before we hopped on, there's been, some maybe mending of that relationship. But it's a real it's a real head scratching situation right now. What have you taken away from it?
Well, it does. I mean, it seems like there's, with between the heart emojis and some of the clips that have been shown across social media in terms of interviews that the president has conducted, it seems like it's softening here, and then maybe that was expected to some extent,
Yeah.
right? It's just sort of this high school theater that seems to be playing out in full view of a global audience, and hasn't sort of a natural to and fro to it. But what I took from it were a couple of things. Across the pond, across the Pacific, I would imagine that those in Beijing who are sort of embroiled in this sort of space race 2.0 with U.S. efforts and Western efforts are sort of quietly grinning in terms of this internal drama and dialogue, and that there might be fissions there, however mended. The other question that I think I have is like, we remember the old adage, too big to fail. Well, I mean, is
Yeah.
SpaceX too big to fail? I mean, fundamentally, can you unwind SpaceX from U.S. national security and space priorities? I don't know that you can, because I mean, if you just look at the reliance that the military has, not only with Starlink and Starshield, which is sort of derivative of Starlink, but just the ability to deliver payloads on orbit. I mean, yes, we have another provider here with the United Launch Alliance, but it's had real difficulties with its new rocket Vulcan. SpaceX
You could
itself.
argue the same with New Glenn or someone else, but yeah, that's not close, or it doesn't appear to be close. Um, and it particularly doesn't appear close from a cadence
Oh, the
perspective.
cadence is the most remarkable thing, because when you look at the square numbers and just in terms of last year, SpaceX, terms of overall launches, launched more than half of the global total.
Yeah,
So I mean, you think about that and think about sort of like what it takes to get on orbit, and the growing payload capacities. Eventually, you have to think that Starship is going to figure out its bugs, given the amount of investment there. Though there's questions inevitably in
sure.
that, but you know there is just a lot baked into multi-billion-dollar contracts that has all of us sort of looking toward a global economy that's oriented towards things that operate on orbit. That we talked about, the increased cadence of not only launches but in terms of data processing that's going further and further up there. Eric Schmidt talked about that, and what's become sort of a famous exchange on the Hill. But more broadly speaking, this nature of a single company that has such influence in terms of not only national security effects, but what is I think at the behest of a changing global economy, and is so much in the catbird seat. And I think the question early on was, that SpaceX have an unfair advantage given sort of the nature of Elon's position within the White House. That seems like, you know, that seems like decades ago now
Yeah,
in terms of the news cycle. But
yeah,
I think what's important in this is that it puts front and center some of these sort of quiet conversations that have been had at the Pentagon and on the sidelines and throughout the space industry for a long time now, and made it very much front and center in terms of what policymakers have to confront. And what does this new space age look like? Is it that of a truly democratized market? Is it more of an oligopoly in terms of its control? Is it, how is that symbiosis between federal government and private contractors actually playing out in terms of leaders that can have personal disagreements that have dramatic effects potentially on U.S. policy and U.S. defense and global economy. So, I mean, on its surface, it's just kind of like this strange little back and forth between two of the most prolific social media posters, I think, in history, frankly.
yeah.
But at its core, it exposes some real questions, I think, about the broader industry.
Yeah, the question I took away, and it was one that I think the space community has been dealing with for maybe 15 years or so, and maybe to varying degrees, but it's something you touched on too. It's that reliance on one provider, whether it's for launch, whether it's for Starlink, whether it's for, any capability that the government wants to, whether that's NASA or the intelligence community or the Space Force, They want to be able to compete. They want companies to compete on price, on launch cadence, on latency when it comes to communications. There's this whole range of issues. And um, I think what we've seen the last, 5 or 6 days is maybe that argument that they have not fulfilled maybe some duties in saying, like, is there a viable industrial base? And I think that's a legitimate question. And then I think it leads to another question, which is, what is the role of government in providing an industrial base
Right.
if its purpose is in not just government, but the Pentagon in providing an industrial base to provide for national security? And so I think that's where there's some real questions. And there's probably going to be a lot of soul searching. I think particularly folks who have been in the contracts and requirements space for a long time are probably, looking at some of those questions and seeing, like, hey, what can we do to make sure that there are alternate providers, that if one thing were to change, would there be someone there to take their place? And I think the conversation we're having right now means there's probably not. And that's I know that's a position that the Pentagon officials for a long time have said they don't want to be in. I know NASA doesn't want to be in that spot, and I know there are countries around the world that feel the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that industrial base and that industrial capacity, because you and I have always talked about sort of the quote unquote lunar economy in terms of both the CLIPS program and
Yeah.
some of these private landers that are trying to make hay and really develop the beginnings of infrastructure there for the purpose of human settlements and mining and all these other aspects of like what it takes to kind of establish permanent settlements on another celestial body. But I mean, you were right there with the
Yeah.
folks with ispace, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean.
So I'll tell you, go ahead.
No, no, I was just saying this was not the company's first go at it, too. I mean,
Right.
this was an attempt, a second attempt, the first one happening back in I believe in April of 2023.
Yep.
Similar sort of circuitous path. I think it was 4.5 months journey to the Earth, and even during that time there was a software glitch that sort of was all that stood between iSpace becoming sort of the world's first ever commercial lunar touchdown.
Yeah.
Didn't happen.
Right.
And I think that maybe before we kind of get into the specifics of it, I think that is an important bit of context because, that crash back there in 2023, that followed an earlier Israeli crash. I mean, there's been a lot of spaceships that have crashed into the lunar surface. I mean, I think the thinking is that when you look at the Apollo program and you look at those six crewed landings between 69 and 72, it sort of belays the fact that most attempts throughout history have ended in failure. None of them crewed, fortunately, but I believe I'm pretty certain about this that um, the Soviet Luna 15 mission was crashing into the moon at the very moment that Neil Armstrong was standing on it. So, I mean, you just think about that in the context. A generation later, you have India and Russia crashing their respective landers. Those were national programs, and you've seen some of the issues that the intuitive machines craft had, albeit in a much more sort of difficult region, from further south that we've seen. But this is not easy stuff.
No, no. And I think the conversations we had with the folks at iSpace, they took those lessons from 2023 really, really seriously. And they knew it was hard. They knew that the moon is an incredibly challenging place to land. And I think things were looking really, really good for a long time. They felt like some of the issues that they had spotted, maybe in 23, by the time they had reached similar points in this most recent trip, that they said, hey, we're seeing it. It's much smoother. It's going really well. We're not noticing even these little glitches, but that we got about less the time to land was about 3:17 p.m. Eastern, maybe around 3:15. It appeared that the vehicle was going about 187 kilometers per hour, which is way, way, way too fast.
Yeah.
And shortly thereafter, telemetry was lost, or it wasn't displayed it, what viewers could see. And about 25 minutes later, and a lot of, hand wringing and close-up shots of folks in mission control, I think, we kind of learned that the mission appeared lost. And so it was a tough situation and a tough ending for the day. Um, I was struck by this launched in January, so you're kind of not quite holding your breath and waiting for 4 or 5 months, but you're hoping everything goes right. You're thinking about all the work you put into this previously. We've talked on this podcast before how I'm a sucker for those mission control shots, and
Sure.
there was a reporter who talked to the ispace CEO afterward, and I just wanted to read this quote because it was during a press conference that was held, and they asked, "Did you cry about this?" And he said, "I have not cried. Honestly, there were some times that I almost cried, but I need to lead this company and I need to have strong will to move forward. So it's not time for me to cry. Right now, we don't have the cost, so I can't get emotional and cry. I don't think that's a good idea." But I
Yeah.
thought that was so telling, just because so often we think of these very sterile machines, right? And then it's you forget the emotion, I think, that comes with that for all these teams that, in this case, around the world. In Japan, there was the vehicle was built parts of it were built in Luxembourg. Um, it's a real letdown for folks, and it speaks to, as we talked about, how difficult the situation really is. I think now everyone kind of turns their energy to this next model of a lander called Apex 1.0, and that will launch in 2027. And iSpace also has a separate lander called Series 3 that's also supposed to launch in 2027. And so there's a lot to look forward to. The executives there said, hey, they're going to take the lessons learned and try to apply it as best that they can. But it's again a really tough situation, and you learn right away just how much people have invested, again, financially and also emotionally in this, and
Yeah.
how difficult it really can be.
Yeah, I think the Intuitive Machines has a 2027 launch as well. And it's just, I mean, you've been down there, you've been to these factories, and I've covered them myself, and just, the camaraderie of the teams and sort of the hodgepodge of aerospace engineers and machinists and those with physics backgrounds. And just like, it's this sort of, motley crew of individuals that all kind of come together. And it's really a team effort for years
Yeah,
to build these things. And they give them names and they call them, it's just, the owners of these, and the CEOs often like will go down and sort of whisper to them before launches. So it like they're almost personified in a way,
yeah,
and it's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
hard. It's hard, but it's
It is.
hard to do.
So what do you take from it? What do you think comes next then for this next batch of lunar landers?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, you have to think about sort of the laser altimeters, and that has routinely come up. I think there's a question of, there's only so much that you can pack into the redundancy of these crafts in terms of payload capacities. There's questions of, the architecture. We've seen that with the Intuitive Machines lander, and some questions about its vertical height. Um, so, all of these things are learning steps in the course of creating sort of a viable, FedEx delivery service to the moon, which is effectively
Yeah,
what the Eclipse program is meant to be. The political wherewithal, I wonder about, how the length of contracts, and when you have things like what the president was mentioning with SpaceX that we talked about earlier in terms of canceling contracts, even though that seems to be, both parties are taking a step back now. You wonder long term about the viability of and the continuity of American space policy, which has always been a problem in terms of the continuity between administrations.
yep,
And that was kind of one of the remarkable things about the Biden administration coming in after the first Trump administration, is that you did have continuity with the Artemis program. But that the fact that Jared Isaacman is no longer in the running for the top spot at NASA,
yeah,
and there's real questions that are to be had, not least of which are geopolitical. So a
right.
lot to be watching.
Right. Great. Well, we hope you watch with us. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're going to move to the second part of our podcast this week. We have a great interview lined up. If you have ideas on what's going to happen next with the Trump-Musk relationship, or what's going to happen with the lunar economy, feel free to shoot us a note. We're at spaceminds@spacenews.com.
And now our interview with Dr. Nadia Maroouf.
Dr. Nadia Maroouf, it is great to see you again.
The pleasure is mine, David. It's been a while, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. And thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I think it's germane to start by telling people where we met. It may have said Utah on the map, but it looked like Mars, right? This was in fact this Mars Desert Research Station, which is sort of an analog Martian habitat in the Utah desert. And you were the first person that I met, first person to greet me upon entering the hab. And I believe you were wearing this tech-infused headband used to sort of monitor the vitals of the crew. So I'd like to start there. What were you doing with that headband? What were you doing there in Utah in a place that looked like Mars?
Well, I was the first crew member to meet you because I was the crew medical officer. And as you remember, it was during the pandemic. And so I had to make sure to do a quick COVID test to make sure that we don't have a compromise of the mission, somebody with COVID.
I
And
was
so
negative, by the way.
yeah, it was negative. It was a pleasure to meet you, and it was really wonderful to have you with us for a couple of days, including EVAs and other activities. So you saw what we were doing experiment-wise. So the headband was part of a biomonitoring device, a shirt, and a headband called the AstroSkin. And that device is part of Canada's efforts to contribute to autonomic healthcare monitoring. As you know, when astronauts go to Mars or the Moon or any missions beyond low Earth orbit, you can't rely on Earth-centric healthcare systems. So the efforts is to create a biomonitoring autonomic healthcare device that the crew members can monitor themselves. Or in my case, I was the principal investigator for that project, where all of the crew members had, as you remember, all of us had the headbands and the shirt. And it was the longest continuous healthcare monitoring of any crew. So we wore that device continuously for both 18 days, so 15 days during the mission, and then before and after for baseline.
Right. I think this is sort of what I wanted to talk to you about, in the sense that like a lot of the science that is interesting, a lot of science that's profitable, frankly, is those that have sort of these dual applications, both in space and here on Earth. And the sense of, monitoring healthcare systems. I mean, there are gaps in this country and across the world in which access to healthcare is limited, and that doesn't necessarily mean that access has to be by virtue of technology. And I think maybe that's a place to go with this conversation, in the sense like where that push into space has terrestrial applications.
Oh, absolutely. So just going back to that technology, it's the AstroSkin. It's a company it's a Canadian company, and the aim is to use that technology to monitor astronauts traveling to longer distances away from Earth, and the aim is to make sure that when healthcare issues arise, then you can have contingencies and countermeasures quicker rather than wait too long. And in turn, you can use that technology for instance, our communities up north that don't have access to healthcare, and just basically provide them with the opportunity to be monitored. And then in case there's problems, then you have that live data for a healthcare practitioner that can be hundreds of miles away. Like we were at the MDRS, like the closest hospital was, if I remember correctly, about 300 miles away. And so I did actually use that, unfortunately, to ground a couple of my crewmates when their heart rate was too high, or There were concerns about their respiratory rates or temperatures, etc., to go on EVAs. Because if you remember, you came with us on one of those EVAs, and we are far away into the desert, and we cannot risk one of the crew members fainting or having an emergency in the middle of nowhere. And so that was one of the tests of that technology for 6 crew members continuously. And of course, because it was an experiment, I had to use it in parallel with the gold standard, which is just tests every single day and then communicating it with the mission control.
I
But
think that also sort of betrays
like
the broader aspect of what you're working on, right? Because it's one thing to sort of be operating in remote regions on Earth, but in space, and this sort of speaks to your work of this vaccine that you're working on, which is something I really want to talk about. In space, microgravity just wreaks havoc on the body, right? Everything from bone density loss to muscle atrophy to like shifts of fluid within the body, sort of even accelerating the aging of the heart. And so, like, I wonder if you can maybe kind of get a little bit more into the science of what happens to your body when you're in space and like start focusing there. Because I mean, this is actually topical in the sense that we have 2 NASA astronauts, Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore, who were supposed to be in space for a week, and they've stayed at the station now, the ISS now for over 250 days. So what's happening? What's happening to their bodies?
Well, basically every single system in the body is affected by space travel and exposure to microgravity. Starting by the heart deconditioning. For every 6 months, the heart ages by about 20 years on Earth. Of course, it varies person to person, and these astronauts are some of the healthiest people out there, but it does affect people in basically every single system. So with the heart, like I mentioned, it's parallel to aging on Earth, and radiation, of course, there is higher risk of developing cancer. There's vision issues, which is related to cardiovascular issues as well. I can dive in a little bit deeper on that. Like we talked about the fluid shifting in the upper extremities, because our biggest vessels, like the aorta and the vena cava, the biggest ones are up here, and so
they actually start to reshape a little bit too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It reshapes, and then the compliance. So you can think about blood vessels and the heart like a balloon. If there is just too much volume in there, then the compliance kind of just deteriorates with time.
Like no more of that
And then, of
elasticity.
course,
It sort of stays that
elasticity, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, that fluid shifting into the upper extremities, it also goes up to the brain. There is too much pressure in the cranium. It has nowhere to go. And so it starts putting too much pressure on the optic nerve. Vision starts to have issues. For example, a lot of astronauts will experience what's called cotton wool vision, which is like just patches in their vision, or bone density goes down quite a lot, between 5 and 8% every month.
I mean, I think this is like the bigger question, right? Because if you hear all the commentary about the nature of settlements up there and prolonged space, and we're talking about the Artemis Base Camp and the International Lunar Research Station that the Chinese and Russians are putting up there. I mean, all these are centered around having a more prolonged and sustained human presence on Earth. And so, like, the technology seems to be it seems like we're already there. Like we can do this with the sort of the machinery, but from the biological standpoint, that's a bigger question, seemingly.
And so I think in terms of, there's still technological issues. That's the reason why we are not in Mars right now, technological operational issues. But the biggest hurdle is the medical one. And so you cannot send astronauts to a colony in Mars or the Moon. The Moon is probably more reasonable, but you cannot keep them there for long enough that they will do impactful work. Right now, the standards are, I think, 1 month continuous lifetime spent on the Moon for women and 40 days for men. If you want them to still be healthy and still be ethical about these people spending time there. In Mars, we are thinking about 2 years just to get there. If the planets are aligned properly, I think by the time they get there, it's going to be problematic unless you have contingencies
Right.
to prevent those issues happening with every single system in the body.
I mean, there are like these ideas of creating artificial gravity and sort of these rotating structures up there, and so that like might mitigate it. But then you have, questions about radiation exposure and all sorts of things that, just seem there's only so much testing you can do on Earth when it comes to this stuff. But I wanted to actually talk to you about talk about this vaccine, and so it's sort of like this cardio protective vaccine that you're working on. And, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like I remember last time that we talked, it has to do with what HSP27, which is like the chaperone
Yes.
protein, right? Which is sort of protects cells from stress injury. And it's kind of like akin to what you might find if you go in a sauna or you work out. But like
Absolutely. Yeah.
how you can sort of operationalize that in terms of looking at sort of the broader problems for astronauts when they have, the shifting fluids or the pressure on their hearts, or maybe a weakened heart because they're not working against that gravity like they do here on Earth, and how that might be applied not only to astronauts in space, but here on Earth, because I mean, it seems like heart disease is like the leading cause of death worldwide. I think in the U.S., I was reading, the U.S. alone is like 1 in every 5 deaths has been linked to heart disease. So this has like real applications, not just for sort of the pie in the sky dreams of settlements and such on Mars and the moon elsewhere, but for everyday folks here on Earth.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. So the cardiovascular disease, especially ischemic heart disease, and atherosclerosis is the cause of ischemic heart disease, is the leading cause of death worldwide. Just to give you perspective, in 2000, it was, if I remember correctly, about 2.7 million deaths from heart disease. And in 2024, 9 million of
Wow.
deaths from heart diseases. So it is still the leading cause of death worldwide. And unfortunately, even during the pandemic, where a lot of people were unfortunately dying everywhere in the world, cardiovascular disease was still above the pandemic and COVID-19 killing people. So as you mentioned, just to give the audience a little background about heat shock protein 27, it is a chaperone protein that is protective against stress usually. But just by chance, my prof discovered that it is a foot soldier of estrogen. And so that's the reason why women usually don't have as many heart attacks compared to men up until the point when they reach menopause, and
Well,
then
that's
it
interesting.
flips. And then it flips, yeah. And so we isolated the heat shock protein and then we turned it into a vaccine. And it's not a vaccine in the traditional sense. We also discovered that heat shock protein antibodies form a complex with heat shock protein. And then when the body is stressed, when we start to get older, then it kind of releases and provide that protection. And so in terms of cardiovascular disease, heat shock protein 27 does two things. It increases the expression of low density lipoproteins in the liver. So basically, it takes away all the cholesterol or the bad cholesterol, and then it metabolizes it instead of just roaming in the circulation. And the other thing it does, it reduces inflammation, because with atherosclerosis or the hardening of the blood vessels, you need two things. You can have high cholesterol, no problem. You can have inflammation. Of course, there are problems. But then when you have the two, that's the perfect recipe for atherosclerosis and heart disease, and eventually ischemic.
So as it relates to space, is this sort of the intention is that, once this kind of matures and goes through trials, that astronauts would essentially be given a vaccine of something of this sort to sort of ward off, especially if they're going to be operating in space for long periods of time, and then also, it seems like there's a lot of really interesting research in terms of pharmaceuticals that's happening in space, in the space environment. And we're talking about, cells can be cultured in sort of this three-dimensional space without the need for scaffolding, which like potentially allows us to grow like ever more complex tissues and organs and all kinds of new sort of pharmaceutical and drug makers that are just kind of developing new technologies as we look to it. So it almost seems like it's a I don't know. This is more of a question, but like, is there sort of a push and pull here in terms of its both terrestrial applications, but also potential development in some of these emerging microgravity on-orbit labs?
Absolutely. I think with space technologies right now, there's a lot of money in trying to find solutions, to find solutions for healthcare issues in space. But if you solve that, then you're solving a lot of issues here on Earth, including heart disease. So if there was an interest in conducting these experiments in space, that will accelerate the knowledge and the data and understanding, and then you can go back and apply it here on Earth. And so I think it goes hand in hand. And so my hope is that there will be a research mission where I can go and do these experiments and then provide the data to support it and then move it faster, because everything.
So you're going to space, essentially.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, you see a lot of people go into space these days, and I don't mean to be negative, but a lot of people go in, celebrities. And so what is the contribution that, like, what's the point of this mission? I think moving forward, scientists themselves that have designed this experiment should go and conduct these experiments, because it has more impactful and more positive results for people here on Earth.
I would play the devil's advocate. I think that maybe the thinking in terms of the celebrities and such is just sort of drum up popular interest, and that's through popular interest comes greater investments and sort of maybe a normalization of space. But to your point, I mean, you're absolutely right. I actually want to get in sort of the last bit of time that we have here to why you decided to study this. I think this is just a fascinating story. I mean, you grew up in Morocco, and you had a father who was, well, I'm going to let you tell the story, but you had a father that was seemingly pushing you to be empowered in your own right, whether it's through STEM or any other aspects of your life.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a small rural community in Morocco. It was about 5,000 people at that time. I think it's probably about 12,000 right now. And women and men, girls and boys didn't have the same rights, the same privileges, including going to school. Or you can go to school, and then a lot of my friends in high school would just get married. Sometimes they are interested in it. Sometimes there's the cultural norms that, you get married in high school and you start a family, or if you want to go to work, then you do some of the jobs like cashiering, administrative jobs, until you become a mother, and then you focus on your family. I have 5 brothers. My father was I'm hesitant to say, he was a feminist in a place where there were not many men that believed that girls and boys and everybody, if you want to work for what you want, then you should have that opportunity. And so he was he was advocating for me to. Sometimes I was the only girl in the class, and try to just remind me that this is not normal now, but it will pay off later. And so, I was very lucky to have a father like that who helped me and encouraged me to pursue my education. And so, he was my hero. I'm pretty sure a lot of people think like that about their parents, but in my case, I think it was a little bit extreme with regards how far he went to make sure I had those opportunities. And so part of my education, or part of the mandatory things I had to do, was Taekwondo. I was 4 years old when I was enrolled, and that was because he wanted me to be able to defend myself. A lot of girls and women, unfortunately, had to endure a lot of domestic abuse, and it was kind of, people would just brush it off, like, here, you hear it in the news, but over there it's just a daily struggle. I moved to the UK afterwards because I knew in Morocco I was not going to be able to pursue the dreams I wanted to. I continued with my Taekwondo, and the aim was that I was going to finish my undergrad. And I was doing really well in Taekwondo. I was 4 times national champion. And there were talks about me going to, well, not talks, there were plans that I was going to go to Korea, spend a year, come back and aim for Team GB in the Olympics. And I have been to Korea every summer since 2007. So about 4 summers in Korea training. And then the end of my undergrad, my Taekwondo master was one of those people you'd meet once in a lifetime if you're lucky. He was an incredible human being, very passionate about Taekwondo. He gave me a lot of opportunities, including that 1 year training in Korea. February 2010, he had a heart attack on a treadmill when we were training. 52-year-old, healthy. We thought he was healthy, but apparently he had some heart issues. He passed away, and then I still went to Korea in end of May to start my year training in 2011, and then come back to the UK to try to get into the Team GB. And then when I was in Korea, I had a call that my father was in the hospital awaiting heart surgery because he just had a heart attack. Booked a flight. I went to Morocco. I went with him through the surgeries and everything, and then I had a light bulb moment. It was 2 assaults in less than 1 year, people that I really, really, really loved and cared about. And then I got into a master's degree with the focus on cardiovascular pharmacogenomics because I was very interested in personalized medicine. And one size does not fit all. I think pharmaceutical companies really like that one size fits all because that's how they make profit. But I wanted to focus on the personalized aspects of it. And after that, I came to Canada, and I was lucky to get a scholarship to study cardiac sciences with the focus on preventive cardiology, because it just occurred to me that there are statins, there are now PCSK9 inhibitors and all these kind of fancy drugs, but they don't prevent heart disease, they just manage it, or they wait until a heart attack occurs and then you just manage it. And by that time, the heart muscle is already damaged. And there's not much to do except just manage the disease until the person dies, and usually with lower quality of life. And so that's where this vaccine came through. And I'm very lucky because a lot of people would go their entire life without doing something like that. But I was really, really lucky to be involved with that project. And I'm very hopeful that it will make it to markets and people can benefit from it all over the world. And I really hope that, again, it doesn't have to be me, but that experiments can be tested in space and bring the data back to Earth to show that it's working, or it's not working. It's science experiments. We don't know until we put it to a test.
Spoken like a true scientist. Dr. Nadia Maroouf, thank you so much for joining us here on Space Minds.
Pleasure is mine, David.